So good folks, I want to speak to you about the experience at General Council, and I have to tell you that I continue to experiment with speaking to overhead to a PowerPoint. So if we can have the first slide, because I want us to start thinking about the story we had. So John 4, just the highlights of that story so that we have a sense of how what we're doing today fits in and is grounded in the stories of our faith. The Samaritan woman, remember the passage said, a Samaritan and a Jew would not speak. They were seen to be culturally competitive. The Samaritans were seen to be outcasts to the dominant culture that was around, and they were the ones that just didn't do things right. She was a woman. It's true in that day that a woman and a man would not converse in public unless the man was her husband. And yet we see Jesus initiating a conversation with somebody that he's not supposed to be talking to for a couple of different reasons. And not only is he talking to her, but he is asking for her help. So he expresses right off the bat, you are the one with the resources. You have the bucket. I am the one who does not have resources. Can you help me? And she's stunned. She says, are you asking me? Like, wow. She couldn't believe that this was happening. And it was happening at Jacob's Well, which was known to be a place that was the center of tradition. You know, the holder of tradition. They knew the stories of Jacob and Esau and the stories of their forefathers and their ancestors. And this place was really something. The holder of tradition. And yet, Jesus comes in to this place that holds tradition. And he asks for the help of someone he's not even allowed to talk to or not supposed to talk to, because culturally he is the superior one and she is seen to be the inferior one. It happens at midday. Now that is important because nobody comes out in the middle of the day to carry their water, to do the heavy lifting, if they have a choice. So it probably means, because as we go and find out about her life, probably means that she's being ostracized. Because she's had 5 husbands, and you can just see, can't you, the layers of how this story marks her as a person who is kind of an undesirable companion. And so there she is in the heat of the day, alone, at this well which she has to come to because she needs water to live. But she's avoiding the other people. Jesus and this woman engage in a tremendously significant conversation. She tells him about the probably intimate concerns of her life. She's had 5 husbands, or she's had a number of husbands, and the one she's living with now is not her husband. Like, you don't share that kind of detail about your life unless someone has provided and created a remarkably safe, compassionate place in the conversation. None of us do. We're kind of self-protected. And the fact that it was happening with someone who she's not even supposed to be talking to is remarkable. The conversation transforms her life. When she came to the well, she came in the midday all alone, hoping to avoid meeting people. Because of this interaction, this sharing conversation, this opening up, this seeing life in a different way, when she goes back to the village, she goes back as a leader. And she says, hey, come and see, this most remarkable thing has happened. And the community follows her back. She is no longer alone. She's no longer hiding. Because someone took the time to know her and to hear her story. And that made all the difference. It's a wonderful story. So now fast forward to 2018, the General Council. And next slide. Paul Douglas Walfall is the intercultural observer who was at the General Council. And he gave, on the last day, a remarkable speech. And when he gave the speech, he was thanked for it, and the business continued. And then some youth came to the microphone and said, you know what, Paul has just given us some remarkable feedback, and we thanked him for it as if it was nothing, and just went back to business as usual. That's not right. And so then some people tried to make an apology. And at that point, something magical happened. The moderator caught on. And she said, let us hear from the people who speak with a different voice than what the mainstream of our church speaks like. Let us hear from people who are culturally diverse, who have not been to the microphones. And for 2 hours, I got to tell you, through the schedule, all into helter-skelter, eh? But for 2 hours, the moderator held space for people to talk about their experience of being black, of being brown, of speaking English as a second language or third language, of being a person with a disability who looked and traveled differently. And she just kept holding space. So Paul did what I think is an enormous favor, although I have to say it's a hard favor for us to hear. Because he said that the church does not take their own racism seriously. And it is not even an issue that we're conscious of working to understand and to unpack in our own experience. I thought about this congregation, and you remember when you did the affirming process? And people at that time said, you know, I don't have any experience of gay, lesbian, trans people, bisexual people. And you were very deliberate about having a process so that you could hear people's stories, so that you could understand different perspectives. Paul said, in effect, we need to do the same thing around race relations. If we actually want to be an intercultural congregation, we have to understand that people see things differently. And so wasn't it interesting to hear the kids' perspective today? It wasn't such a bad thing to have a broken arm because they got more screen time. You know, that's not the answer I would have given. Next slide, please. Paul told some stories about his experience and stories that he had heard. He's a minister of the United Church, and he said just a few stories. Here's the first one. He said, the first story that I want to tell you occurred a few years ago at a seminar on pastoral relations in Alberta. They were in a small group looking at a case study, and the issue of race was involved. One of his white colleagues said to him, "You know, when I see you, Paul, I do not see the color of your skin. I just see a person." Now, Paul said, to be clear, my colleague honestly thought he was paying me a compliment. However, in my response, I had to say to him, "If what you say is true, then you have rendered me invisible. Invisible because you are not seeing who I am." And then Paul went on to say, "I must confess that for the most part of the past week at General Council, I struggled with the feeling of being invisible. Invisible because I didn't see people in leadership who were like me. My story was never kind of referenced. The stories that got told are told from the mainstream perspective." He says worship was good, and yet he didn't see himself reflected in worship. And I have to confess to you, at that moment I found myself, because I had thought that the worship was quite diverse because they had gay and lesbian people in it, and they had Korean people who spoke English as a second, third language. And I thought, wow, they've really done something. But you see, I think, if you're not like me, then, and we've included somebody, well, everybody's included. But what Paul was saying was, you know, as a black person, I don't feel included just because you have a Korean there. So, he wants that there would be a call within the church to acknowledge that racism exists. And he went on to tell quite a number of stories. He told the story of the black woman who went to an interview in one of our United Church congregations, and she was told that she wouldn't get the job because the church wasn't ready for a woman. Then, a month later, they called a Caucasian woman. And he said, like they're not trying to say that we're bad for this. What they're trying to say is, let's bring it out into the open. Let's make and let ourselves become aware. Let us learn to, let us first acknowledge that racism exists. And Martin Luther King Jr., he had this thing that he said the church is to be the beloved community. And he said that for us to really move in our race relations and our cultural awareness, that we have to first acknowledge and then confront and then transform the way we interact with one another. If we learn to dialogue and really ask questions about what someone else's experience is like. And, I feel like we've already started that here at St. Aidan's with those third Sunday workshops that Julie leads us in, where people get to talk together about subjects that are deeper than kind of social conversation. So learning to dialogue, learning to listen to each other's stories without feeling defensive or like we have to protect ourselves, to take a look at who is missing from the table and what place do people have at the table. So it was an eye-opening General Council. And the ripples will continue to be felt. Can I have the next slide, please? St. Aidan's, I think, we're already on the path. We're trying to learn how to have an intercultural focus, how to have intercultural conversations, and share with one another our different spiritual understandings. I want to propose that in our intercultural ministry that we've got a 3-year grant, and we've had 2 years of it. And I want to propose that we make a course correction, just like in Saskatchewan, where you get the roadway going quite straight, and then suddenly you're over here and there's been a course correction. I think that we have discovered now from what we've been doing for the past 2 years that the group that is moving into our area most predominantly are Asian folks. And we have not yet found the way to really engage with the majority of the Asian folks. And partly that is because we don't have anybody on staff who looks Asian, right? Like people don't know that it's safe. So we're proposing, Mari's going to go in a different direction and teach, and she's got her BC teaching certificate. So we're proposing, and actually it's going to happen, that Julie is going to be our intercultural minister. She's going to work 10 hours. She's already doing the bridging work. She's both here and we know her, she's part, but she represents a different story. So Mavis, who has been one of our summer students, is going to do her internship here from Royal Roads, and she's studying intercultural communication. So she's got a little over 200 hours to complete her internship. She's going to be working with Julie. And we're going to have, I hope, an interesting and lively engagement. There's a course that is being recognized amongst all the churches of Canada as doing significant cultural education. It's called Deepening Understandings of Intercultural Ministry. It's a week-long intensive experience. And they've been wanting for a year or so to have a course held out here in Victoria. And we're proposing that St. Aidan's will host that event, and that we'll put some of Julie's time and some other people's times into organizing and offering that event. In some ways, that's a lot of news. I want to remind us why we do this. With the woman at the well, when she had a really significant conversation with Jesus, where she was safe to really tell her story, her life was set free. She was transformed. That is what we hope for our congregation and for those with whom we minister. I see my dear wife looking at her watch, and and so I want to stop there, but I want to say, like, St. Aidan's has been on this journey for 2 years, and I think that this coming year is going to be a marvelous year for us to work at listening, hearing, sharing, and in that way transforming. Thank you for listening.